Okay. So start now, group one.
Excuse me, miss, can my screen be seen?
Yes. But you have to present it as a whole. Lang. Present it. Kana.
Okay,
Sige.
miss. I'll re-present it then so that it can be seen.
Hindi siya full. Kuan.
Yes, miss. So the entire window can be seen. Um, uh, presenter full screen. I don't think it can be presented as a full screen,
Sige
miss.
lang.
I'll just present it.
Present it
I
na
just
lang.
present it like this, miss. Yes,
Yeah,
miss.
yeah.
So you can start,
It's
miss.
okay.
Okay,
Sige.
miss.
Start.
Thank you, miss.
Timer starts.
Good morning, everyone. So, we are Group 1 sharing with you the philosophical perspective of the self. What we'll be talking about specifically from our group is the philosophical perspective from ancient Western philosophers. So, we're going to be talking about Thales, Democritus, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then also religious Christian philosophers such as St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. We'll be talking about what the self is for them and why.
So, as a brief introduction, philosophy in a broad sense is an activity that people undertake when they seek to understand fundamental truths about themselves, the world in which they live in, and their relationships to the world and to each other. Western philosophy originated in ancient Greece, and one of its key figures are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, let us discuss Thales of Miletus. Next slide, please.
Have
Thales.
a common background. I just noticed it.
So Thales was a Greek mathematician, an astronomer, a statesman, and a pre-Socratic philosopher. He was one of the seven sages of Greece, and he attempted to identify the primary principle of the natural world. Aristotle identified Thales as the founder of the school of natural philosophy since he was the first person to investigate the basic principles and the originating substances of matter. He was also remembered for his cosmology based on water as the essence of all matter, in which he concluded that Earth is a flat disk floating on a vast sea.
Mm.
According to Thales, all living things possess a life principle called the soul. He said that objects need to have something different inside them, in which he referred to as the prime mover to explain their actions. Thus, Thales defined the soul as the source of movement. Thales also said that the most difficult thing in life to know is yourself. According to him, we may think that we know ourselves, but the mere fact is that we really don't. Sometimes we ask ourselves obvious questions such as, why was I born? Why did I experience this and that? Obvious questions that we ourselves answer with hesitation. Now let's move on to Democritus.
So, Democritus, although during his time was dubbed the laughing philosopher whom no one wanted to take seriously, was the genius that founded the theory of atomism, a theory that started a lively discussion on the mechanistic perspective. Democritus believed that atoms was the fundamental building block that make up all things that exist. Quite plainly, atoms was everything. According to him, the atom is the lower limit of divisibility because it can no longer be split to reveal something smaller. These atoms are in constant motion and they entangle with one another to bring things into the physical world. Now, I know this sounds very scientific. So, how does this relate to us and ourselves?
Ref.
Democritus believed that even the human soul and mind are made up of fire atoms. Following his perspective, his bold claim was that the motion of atoms drives all living things to move even without the influence of a soul or what Thales referred to as a prime mover. This is often criticized because it basically contradicts the concepts of free will and determinism. Furthermore, Democritus linked his theory of atomism to human experience and perception. He claimed that the qualia we experience, such as the sweetness of honey, the redness of a rose, and other kinds of senses that we perceive, are mere conventions and are actually not real and are not part of nature. In reality, they do not exist in the physical world because atoms, which make up everything that exists, do not have qualities. These qualia are products of our human consciousness and are therefore not reliable to know the truth. Thus, the truth of what is real is essentially hidden from plain sight. And Democritus believed that the only way to get closer to seeing what is real is through the use of reason. Let us move on to the next.
All right, so we know many philosophers, both ancient and modern, have contributed greatly to our understanding of society. One good example of this is Socrates. Socrates was a well known ancient Greek philosopher who frequently questioned things that have never been thought about or brooded over. Due to his curiosity, he became the first philosopher to question the meaning of the self, such as who we are, who we should be, and who we will become. According to Socrates, one should know thyself. Many philosophers agree that knowing oneself is necessary for living a content and meaningful life. After all, the self has the ability to perceive, know, and comprehend what it is experiencing. If one does not know what makes them happy and content, how else would one know if they are happy? This question leads to another one of Socrates' famous quotes: An unexamined life is not
Yeah.
worth living. Socrates believes that one should reflect first in order to attain wisdom, because self reflection allows one to see one's own strengths, needs, weaknesses, and longings, enabling them to take purposeful action in order to live a meaningful life. Socrates also thinks that every human person is dualistic, or that man has two aspects of personhood: the body and the soul. And as for Socrates, the true self is not the physical body, but rather the psyche or the soul, because the soul is the source of one's thoughts, desires, dreams, and ambitions, and thus he integrates the concept of consciousness as experienced by the self to the soul. Now let's move on to the next one, please.
Plato is an ancient Greek philosopher, founder of the academy, and was a student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle. He was strongly influenced by Parmenides and Zeno with his theory of the forms. Among his works include the differences between the early and middle dialogues, immortality and reincarnation, moral psychology, and theory of forms. Now, how does Plato conceive of the soul as the true self of humans? Plato discusses the true self in the context of knowledge and embodiment, which involves gaining knowledge of the world of forms and world of phenomena. The first is permanent and eternal, and the second is constantly changing. Plato argued that self is fundamentally an intellectual entity whose nature exists independent from the physical world. He conceives of the self as a knower and explains the philosophy of self as process of self-knowledge and purification of soul. Plato's concept of the self is built with his reflections on nature of the rational soul as the highest form of cognition as his basis. For Plato, the body and soul can be separated. He believes that the soul resides in the body temporarily, thus arriving to the idea that when a person dies, their soul departs from the body, leaving it to decompose because it is intangible and indestructible, hence, it cannot die. According to Plato, the soul has three parts: rational, spiritual, and appetitive. Rational soul is located in the head, which enables the human person to do cognitive activities. Spiritual soul is located in the chest, which enables the human person to experience emotions. Finally, the appetitive soul is located in the abdomen, which drives the human person to experience physical ones. Next is Aristotle.
So, who is Aristotle? Aristotle is an ancient Greek philosopher, a scientist, and overall one of the greatest intellectual figures of Western history. So, what are Aristotle's beliefs on the notion of self? So, Aristotle's philosophy of self was constructed in the terms of hylomorphism. So, what is hylomorphism? Hylomorphism is the belief that a particular object has a form that is inseparable from it. So, with that, Aristotle believed that the soul or the self is the structure of the human matter of the body. And without the soul, the body wouldn't be able to function because the human matter, which is the self, is the functional organization in virtue where humans are able to perform different characteristic activities of life, which is our ability to have imagination, desire, and thinking. And from that, Aristotle expounds further on the psyche or the self to three functions, which are the nutritive psyche, sensitive psyche, and rational psyche. So Aristotle believed that our bodies in the self have different levels of degrees which can be high or low. For example, all living things have the nutritive psyche because it is the ability for living things to grow, nourish themselves, and reproduce. So that would include plants, animals, and humans. The next is the sensitive psyche. The sensitive psyche is the ability for certain living things to be able to perceive different things and be able to have movement. That would include humans and animals. And lastly is the rational psyche. Only humans have the rational psyche because the rational psyche is the ability to reason, comprehend, and think. So, hence, with all of that, Aristotle believed that humans have all forms of psyche, so that means that us humans have the highest form of psyche. So next will be Saint Augustine.
Okay. So, Neoplatonism believes in a single supreme source of goodness and being from which all other things derive or use it as basis. It also argues that when there is absence of goodness and perfection, it is evil. To generalize, Neoplatonism supports the existence of souls and how it is superior and differs from the human physical body. This influenced several major religions, such as Christianity and Islam. So, what makes Neoplatonism different from Platonism? Platonism is distinguished by the technique it employs to separate the finite world of forms, which refers to people, animals, and objects, from the infinite world of the ideal or one. Christian Neoplatonism, on the other hand, strives to identify the one or God in the finite world and human experience. So, why are we talking about Neoplatonism and Platonism? This actually has something to do with Saint Augustine, one of the people who are influenced by Neoplatonism and known as one of the greatest Christian philosophers of all time, and did claim that if the Platonists were born in his time, they would have chosen to be Christians. Given that he is a religious philosopher, he assumes the existence of God and that our souls has the capability to unite with our Creator through faith and reasoning. He believes that contempt of the self, or the process of freeing the soul from the self, is considered a quest for heaven that undergoes several processes. This is why he believed that there is what we call city of God, which is composed of two cities. Earthly city is focused on satisfying the human greed. Heavenly city dwells on uniting the soul to God and disregarding any earthly desires, which also leads us to selfishness. With this illustration, he was able to make a distinction between the world and the church, which will clearly express his beliefs. Next is
So the last philosopher we'll be talking about is Saint Thomas Aquinas, who is one of the greatest Christian theologians of all time. So for Saint Thomas Aquinas, he followed the same principles as those of previous philosophers, wherein humans were composed of a soul, right, and a body. However, for him, where he differed is that for him, the self was made from the union of the body and the soul, which means that there is a necessary for both of these two things to coexist together for there to be a self. Now, furthermore, to expound on this, he also believed that the union of the body and the soul is mutually beneficial. How? Because for him, humans were able to experience the world, gain experiences around them empirically, right? Through their own experiences, through their own sight, through their own senses, and the like. However, for this to occur, there needed to be a union between the body and the soul. It was only through the union of the body and the soul that the self would be able to experience the world around us and to be able to gain experiences and thus gain an identity and gain knowledge and the like. Now, the way in which Saint Thomas Aquinas was able to conform his idea to Christianity was by having humans have a different kind of soul from other kinds of living beings. Since humans were created in the image of God, human souls were superior compared to other kinds of souls, compared to the souls of plants or the souls of other kinds of animals, which meant that human souls continued to exist even after death. So the way in which this works is that once humans die, their souls continue to exist even after death, and their souls are separated. So they still exist. They still exist as a self, albeit in an incomplete form because they lack their body. Now it is in the second coming of Christ when Jesus Christ resurrects from the dead and
Mhm.
resurrects all of the humans right with him, that when they have their new bodies, these souls merge again with their body to form a new self. So this was the way in which Saint Thomas Aquinas was able to talk about the self, how it was
Mhm.
a necessary union between the body and the soul, and how he was able to integrate this idea into his Christian beliefs. Now,
Mhm.
with all of this being said, I would like to give our group's conclusion. So we were able to give and present the philosophical perspective of the self. So what is philosophy? Well, philosophy is essentially the study of fundamental questions, very basic and fundamental questions. And one such fundamental question that philosophers have been trying to think about all this time is what really is the self? When does a being begin to become a human being? And such questions, right? What is our identity and the like? And
Mhm.
we were able to discuss these concepts based on classical and pre-modern Western philosophers. So Thales, Democritus, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas, all of these great people. And for them, philosophy, the concept of the self is, well, it can't really be described. It's not really something that we can place or put into words. For them, they had different kinds of ideas on what the self is. Some of them thought that the self was the things that made us, the things that or that we are composed of, essentially. For some of them, they thought that the self was the soul. For some of them, it was a mixture of the soul and the body. For some of them, it was a mixture of the soul and experiences that we have. But it's a very broad topic, and it's not something that can be placed into words clearly. But ultimately, for all of them, for our group, for the philosophical perspective, the self is something more than what can be seen, and it goes beyond what we can physically touch or physically see. It's something that goes beyond our senses, essentially. So with that said, thank you very much, and this has been Group One, philosophical perspective.
Okay, thank you, Joshua, for putting concisely summarizing all the group's thoughts on the the philosophical perspectives of the self. Okay, very good. Just one question for all the entire group members. Okay, so with all of these perspectives of the philosophical perspectives, like what Joshua said, there is no conclusive, okay, conclusive unified perspective about what the self is, especially with regards to the mind, the body, and the soul, right? Diba? As what Joshua said, there is no conclusive, there are mixed perspectives about this. In view of the current current lifestyle that we have, the current views of the of life that we have right now, do you think this has these perspectives, the philosophical perspectives that you presented, these have an influence, or these can help an influence, or these can this be an aid? Can this be helpful to how we are living our life right now? Because as what you have mentioned, Joshua, there's no concrete, tangible, okay, definition of all these things. But with these things, how can these, okay, how can these help influence or affect the way we see life in the current times? Do you think it has an effect? Do you think nakalimtan na ni siya, it doesn't have an effect or influence or significance? Any member from the group can answer to that. Yes, Joshua. And I also ask Therese later on.
For me, miss, yes, miss. These all still have their impact even until today. And the
Mhm,
reason for that is because all of these are foundations. When you think about these names, these philosophers, they're all
mhm,
foundations for current Western philosophical thought. So,
mhm,
for example, Democritus, right? For Democritus, he was the father who gave or proposed the idea of atoms, and then even until now, we still discuss and talk about atoms. Like their ideas have changed over time because it's passed on from different kinds of people like that, and it's been changed, it's been reformed, but the very basic concepts that they suggested still exist until now, and they're still being used now, just in different forms and different formats. For example, for Democritus, it's now in the form of atoms. For St. Thomas Aquinas, in his works, his teachings, and his writings in Christian theology are still being used until now, right? The kinds of things he thought of, like his thoughts on the resurrection of the dead, for example, for Christianity. And of course, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all of those are very big names in Western philosophy. Even
mhm,
until now, there's still like Platonic movements. Like we still refer back to their works, to what
mhm,
they said before about the soul, about the concept of identity, for example, etc. So I believe, Miss, that yes, even until now, we still do use these concepts, even if it might be different from how they mentioned it all those years ago. We
Mhm.
still do use them now, just in a different form and in a more revised or in a more modern way, essentially.
Thank you for that, Joshua. Um, would somebody want to add? I think it was some yeah, theories. Theories was yes, theories. We add
Um,
more theories.
So to answer your question, Miss, I feel like the impact of like these ancient like concepts about the self, its impact right now is that especially during the pandemic, since we're not totally over it yet, especially during the pandemic, I feel like we were kind of like depressed because okay, we're disconnected from people around us. We can't really go out and have fun and like do things that we thought made us truly happy. I think the impact of these concepts is that it teaches us that like happiness in ourselves is we can find it like within us, like it doesn't have to be, it's not something that we have to necessarily get from something outside of us, because since the self is in our soul, like what Socrates said, that like the key talaga to find our happiness or what we want in life is self-reflection. So I feel like now is the time for us to take advantage of like this alone time. Now we'll look into ourselves and find what we lack, what we have, and focus there instead of just like keep on looking outside of ourselves, even though what we need is like with us all along. So parang it's that's the concept that I think that these concepts would impact us right now in the present world.
Okay, I'm so glad that you, as young, the young ones right now still think that these, because sometimes they might, most, if admittingly, would say, what's the use of studying philosophy? These Socrates, Plato, okay? So good thing that you are able to reflect, okay, that these philosophers laid the foundation of how we see life right now. Okay, as what Therese mentioned, during the pandemic, we're able to reflect. As what Socrates mentioned, an examined life is not worth living. So you have to be able to reflect about life. So thank you, group one. Okay, good job. Okay, so thank you. Group two, can you now start?
Hello, Miss. I'll be sharing my screen right now.
Okay,
I just like to ask for confirmation, Miss. Makita na ko screen.
makita na. Araw.
Okay, sige. Thank you,
Okay,
Miss.
sige.
We'll begin.
Okay,
The
start.
ideation of the Miss.
Okay, start.
Sorry,
Sorry, start.
I'll begin na, Miss. Okay.
Okay.
The ideation of the human self is a common theme in philosophical literature, primarily in German and English writings. Modern philosophy embodied itself as a continuation of the growing interest for humanism, which appears to extend towards humanity and the self after the Renaissance revived classical philosophies of Socrates and Plato. We are group two, and we are here to discuss the different modern philosophers that had a bit of a dabble in the perspective of the self. We have Axel J. Belingan, Andre Vidal, yours truly, Angelique Gasal, Brianna Sofia Capuno, Kendrick Larada, Lance Jovian Chan, Maxine Sardido, and Michaela Sarsali. So to start with, we'll begin with John Locke by Maxine and Ken. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. In this report, we will be discussing about John Locke, who was an English philosopher and one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment. Now, John Locke's ideas about the self, which were an important contribution to the field of philosophy, believe that we are not born with any knowledge or ideas, but instead learn everything from our experiences. He thought our mind is a blank sheet of paper, and everything we write on it is what we learn from the world around us.
Locke believed that our personal identity is not determined by our physical body, but by our thoughts and experiences. He thought that what makes us who we are the things we remember and the experiences we've had. The self, according to Locke, is not a thing, but a collection of our memories, beliefs, and experiences. It's always changing as we learn and grow.
how we understand personal identity. They have helped us see that who we are is not fixed or predetermined but is shaped by the experiences we have throughout our lives. So the next presenter, please.
So next we have René Descartes. So René Descartes was a French philosopher widely regarded as a seminal figure in modern philosophy. He asserted the need to doubt all things.
Kayla, can you turn on your cam if you can?
Ay, yes, miss. So, once again, Rene Descartes was a French philosopher widely regarded as a seminal figure in modern philosophy. He asserted the need to doubt all things one has been taught without question, as it is a necessary condition for arriving at reasonable conclusions. So, cogito ergo sum, which translates to I think, therefore I am, constitutes the first principle of his knowledge in philosophy. Furthermore, he asserted that a person could have a distinct concept about the thinking self or the essential self and the body.
The body, which is the physical self, is governed by the laws of nature, while the mind, which is the conscious self, is part of what is spiritual and eternal. Hence, he was considered a rationalist for these assertions.
Mm-hmm.
Being conscious of oneself is the key to why one holds a sense of selfhood. Without the ability to be aware of the self, one cannot gain any idea of personal identity. Next slide, please.
Rihanna, can you turn on your camera?
Miss, I can turn on my camera, miss. Like, lag jud kaayo, nag-data ra ko, wala may wifi.
Sige, sige. Chance.
David Hume is
Okay.
a Scottish philosopher, essayist, historian, and economist. David Hume was a renowned for his philosophical skepticism and empiricism. Hume argued that our concept of the self is a result of our natural habit of attributing unified existence to any collection of associated parts. This belief is natural, but there is no logical support for it. Hume asks us to consider what impression gives us our concept of self. We
Mm-hmm.
tend to think of ourselves as self stable entities
Mm-hmm.
that exist over time, but no matter how closely we examine our own experience, we never observe anything beyond a series of transient feelings, sensation, and impression.
Kurt
Next slide,
Goldstein.
please.
Kurt Goldstein is a German psychologist. Kurt Goldstein is a German psychologist and neurologist. He created a thorough, all-encompassing scientific methodology discussing his theories in his writings titled In the Organism and in a condensed version in Human Nature, which discusses the summation of his holistic theory of the human organism. Goldstein was particularly cognizant of how scientific outcomes are influenced by procedure. In one of his scientific endeavors, he argued that the self is the ultimate goal of the human organism. In its process of self actualization and the tendency thereof is its primary drive in determining its process. Next slide, please.
Immanuel Kant was a German thinker, academician, logician, and university professor who became a linchpin of the Enlightenment era, dealing with metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. He's particularly known by his critique of pure reason and practical reason, which gave birth to Kantianism or the ethics of duty. Kant's idea of the human self centers around the concept of the transcendental ego. He believed that the self is not a tangible object that can be observed or measured, but rather an active and necessary component in the process of human perception and understanding. Accordingly, the self serves as a unifying force that allows us to make sense of our sensory experiences and create a coherent picture of the world around us. Ultimately, according to Kant, the self is a fundamental aspect of our rationality and agency as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so hello. So Sigmund Freud is an Austrian neurologist and is considered as one of the greatest psychologists of all time. He mainly studied the personality, the dynamic organizations between the three mental states that determines the uniqueness of the person. According to Freud, the mind comprises of three mental states: the conscious, the unconscious, and the preconscious. The conscious is the one that is constantly aware. The unconscious is the one that is not aware, and the preconscious is the material that is not accessible to one's consciousness but can be retrieved at any moment. The easiest way to describe the preconscious is the memory. We do not constantly think of it, hence it is not in our current state. However, once asked or reminded, we can easily retrieve it from the back of our minds and speak of it. He describes the way the three states work as a sailboat sailing in the ocean of unconsciousness, with the sailboat referring to our conscious thoughts. He believes that the unconscious mind is a dominant part in our pers- personal personal personality of self, as within it lies our thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Furthermore, he proposed three structures of the personality, which are the id, or the raw urges, the ego, the seat of consciousness, and the superego, the one that holds our values and morals. The delivery of thought is made by the id by expressing its desires, the superego expressing its morality, and the ego being the intermediary between the two thoughts and thinking of ways to satisfy both. Freud basically proposed that the mind, ourselves, is not fragmented and that it works in ways wherein our thoughts are compressed into one where all desires can be appropriately expressed. You do not distinguish the act as solely coming from one of the three structures, but instead as an outcome of the dynamics between the three. Next slide, please. Uh, how are the works relevant? So, the varied perspectives of the aforementioned thinkers appear to be inconsequentially disconnected, apparently rendering modern philosophy as a loose collective of modernist thinking. However, a central theme among their conceptualized notions is their fundamental basis of logic, science, and psychology, disregarding religion and mythology as formative to the ideation of the self. Such attributes has removed modern philosophy from the clutches of theology and made their epistemological and metaphysical views of the self more reasonable and, in some facets, scientific. That is the end of our presentation. If you have any questions, thank you. That was
So,
Thank you.
okay, next questions sa each one ninyo. Okay, so my question is really simple because your task was to describe or to discuss different perspectives of the self from these different modern philosophers, right? Starting from Rene Descartes and ending with Sigmund Freud, right? Okay, my question is simple. In just one statement, how can you summarize or concisely describe how the philosopher that you are assigned to, okay, example, how does Rene Descartes view the self? How can give me one statement? Okay, can we start with kasi get to start si Kendrick, si Maxine, John Locke. Okay, how did John Locke view the self? If you're supposed to give me one statement to summarize of all the concepts that discussed, how did John Locke describe view the self? Maxine and Kendricks. The same. This is the same question all throughout the members. Okay, if I'm gonna ask you that question, how do these philosophers view the self, or in just one statement? Maxine and Kendricks. So let's start with John Locke.
And miss, we exist because we are conscious.
Okay, correct. We exist because we are conscious. So hence, so get no hands for John Locke. Everybody listen to this. Hands for John Locke. The self is consciousness because we are conscious. Okay. So as what you've mentioned, when we were born in a blank slate. So our experiences fill in uh, that blank slate. So he believes that our self is constructed primarily from our experiences. Okay? So self-consciousness is necessary to have a coherent personal identity or the knowledge of the self as a person. Thank you for that. Next, how about Descartes? Let's have Descartes.
Miss, do not take anything as true unless it is clearly evident. Since Descartes believes na you need to doubt things in order for it to become certain.
Okay. So, baliktas sa yan. I think, therefore I am. What does it mean, simply put? Michaela, Brianna, what does I think, therefore I am mean? In layman's term. Ano nakaingon man si Rene Descartes, ana? What do you think, based on your own research? Siya basta I think, therefore I am. It is, but
He means miss na the certainty of one's existence is the ability to think and be conscious. So basically, ga-exist ka because you are thinking. So
okay,
therefore, ano, conscious ka.
okay, correct. So being conscious of self is the key as to why we hold a personal identity and a sense of selfhood. Because without the ability to be conscious of self or to be aware of ourselves, we cannot gain an idea of personal identity. In other words, we cannot have a sense of self. So mo itong giingon ni Michaela, there is a need to doubt. Okay? And this is important in order to know what one is certain about. It is the right way to start when it comes to building a system of belief, and this allows us to create a solid foundation for ideas about the world and about ourselves. Thank you for that. How about the next one? David Hume. So, Kwani David Hume, Lance. Review is David Hume about the self, Lance. Are you there, Lance? Asa si Lance? Oh, Mr. Lance Chan. Wala lagi siya. Ayo, Lance, are you there? Please contact your groupmate.
We're
Si Lance.
contacting him na, ma'am.
Sige. Next lang ta. Can we go to Vidal? Yes. Oh, no. Wait, let's go to Kwanza. Kanang Emmanuel.
So,
Yes, Andre. Kanang ato sa tang Emmanuel Kant ha. Kasumpay mo na si David Hume Gold si Kant. Sige.
okay.
Louis.
Hello,
Emmanuel
ma'am.
Kant. What is
With regards
say
to
view?
Immanuel Kant, he is basically saying that the self is the driver of sensory experiences. You can't experience those fundamental concepts of the world, the empirical happenings of the environment without the self. And it is
Mhm.
also equivalent to our rationality and ability to choose as human beings. That is why for Immanuel Kant, the one statement that you could say of his belief in the self is that the self is the driver for sensory experiences.
Okay. So the self constructs its own world. Okay. So the we are the ones who construct the self. It is the self that makes experiencing an understandable world possible. Okay? So siya ang driver sa tanan. Okay? Thank you for that Louis. Yes, Andre. How about Kurt Gold?
Um, so Kurt Goldstein's he thinks that the objective in the process of self-actualization is the self. So it serves as a motivation for deciding what is right and what is wrong and what he or she should do with his own life. Means
Okay, so he has this organimist theory, right? Nga ingon siya nga sa to yang theory there nga organism is already an organized system from the very start, that
na
each component cannot be
yeah.
abstracted from the whole, so in order to understand it. So therefore Therefore, with this theory from Kurt Goldstein, there is no need to identify, the different, the components or the parts define the whole. Mana iyahang kuan ang kang Kurt Goldstein. Okay, thank you. Okay, how about kang Sigmund Freud? Axel?
Yes, miss. So for Sigmund Freud, his thought is basically that the three states of mind, the conscious and the conscious, unconscious, and the preconscious are the drivers of our thought. So our thought, our being, our personality is based on those three structures that are meshed together basically to deliver one coherent thought.
Okay. Okay. So kana siya for Sigmund Freud, the self is okay, the self is multi-layered. Okay, because we are three layers of the self. Like, I think we have to remember that we have the id, the ego, and the super ego. So for Sigmund Freud, the self is multi layers. Okay, so that would be all for group two. Si Chan, what to ni answer?
Miss, miss,
Nana si Chan, sige Dave.
Wi-Fi problem.
Oh, si David Hume. So, sa mga, what is the view, David Hume as a whole?
The concept of the self is a result of our natural habit.
Why do you say so?
Um, because it attributing the unified existence of any collection associated partners. And this belief is natural, but there is no logical support for it, though.
Mm. Actually, Chance, to add to what Chan said, for Hume, di ba si Hume kay it's based on experience. The self is based from experience, so empiricists. David Hume is an empiricist. So, ingon siya nga everything that we experience, what we experience is just a bundle of or collection of different sensation ideas, and these are just temporary. These feelings are fleeting. Mo na nakaingon si David Hume, remember this guys, there is no self. Mo na ingon siya kay these are just bundle of experiences that are fleeting, that are temporary. Okay, mo na our feelings, our thoughts, our perceptions are just fleeting. We're only aware of that at that very moment, and mawala na siya after that moment. So hence for David Hume, we do not have an impression of the self. Hence for him, there is no self. There is no self. Mo nang kan David Hume. Okay, so thank you, group two. Congratulations. May I now ask group three to present?
Good day, Miss. I'll be sharing my screen.
Please. Okay, we have 12 minutes na lang. Ilang. Kaya na.
Is the screen visible
Yes,
now?
it is visible now,
Okay.
dear.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Miss. We are Group 3, and we will be discussing the anthropological aspect of the self.
Okay.
Next slide, please. Here is the itinerary of our presentation. First, we have culture and the self, the characteristics of culture, and the examples. Next slide, please. So, first, we have culture and the self. So, cultural context shapes how one sees oneself. As discussed in previous presentations and even in philo-anthro subjects in senior high, the self is defined as a person's essential being that distinguishes them from others, especially considered as the object of the introspection of reflexive action. To start, this discussion, anthropology is the study of human societies, cultures, and developments. The self and the anthropological processes are deeply related. In the anthropological process, the self reflects how socially adapting can help increase survival.
Mhm.
This process helps in establishing one's identity. The self reflects a long process of history, and even our names could be a manifestation of that anthropological process.
Mhm.
Now, one's identity is largely connected to the group that shares the same culture. This
Mhm.
is because from the moment one is born, one is influenced by the cultural traditions and practices of one's parents, who are also largely influenced by the broader cultural environment. Now, culture influences how one feels, thinks, and acts, ultimately influencing one's identity. The more one is socially involved, the more he is influenced by the culture because culture is efficiently transmitted through interactions with groups. In this discussion, culture in different contexts and how it influences the self will be dissected and examples will also be provided. Next slide, please.
So the characteristics of culture. So next slide. So the first characteristic of culture is that culture is a shared system. So next slide, please. So by definition, culture is the system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that the members of society use to cope with their world and with one another, and that are transmitted from generation to generation through learning. This means that culture is a byproduct of social interaction and never happens alone. Hence, all cultures are shared. People frequently identify with many cultures, allowing them to interact culturally with a wide range of persons. So, despite the fact that you might consider yourself an individual, others who come from or live in similar cultural backgrounds as you and share your beliefs, rites, ceremonies, traditions, and presumptions, you can relate to people more readily if they share your value systems and methods of doing things than if they don't. So we are all united by cultural patterns, which also makes it easier for us to get along with one another. Although there is one con about shared culture, and that is shared learning can cause blind spots. So despite the fact that it feels nice to be with others who think, act, and behave the same way as you, shared cultures produce an in-group dynamic where people isolate themselves from one another. This means that people would prefer to interact with others who share the same culture as them. But at the end of the day, although it has blind spots, you learn from this that culture is significant since it promotes a feeling of community, improves the standard of living, and facilitates interpersonal relationships. We all feel like we belong to something because of culture, and that is why it is a shared system.
So, example of culture as shared system include language, which is a shared system of communication that is used to express idea, feelings, and belief. It is the primary way that people communicate with each other and is often used to express cultural identity. For example, Spanish is spoken in many parts of Latin America, while English is spoken in the United States.
Mm, correct.
Another example is religion, which is a set of beliefs and practices that are shared by a group of people. It is often used to explain the world and provide a sense of purpose and meaning. For
Mhm,
example, Christianity is the predominant religion in the United States, while
mhm,
Buddhism is the predominant religion in many parts of Asia. Lastly, custom and tradition are the practices and beliefs that are passed down from generation to generation. For example, in the United States, Thanksgiving is a holiday that is celebrated each year, while in Mexico, they celebrate the Day of the Dead.
mhm,
So, culture as learned, shared, symbolic, and integrated. Next slide, please. So, culture is learned, it is constantly changing, context specific, and a way of interpreting the world. So, basically, it is transmitted from one generation to the next through socialization and helps to shape the way what people think, act, and interact with one another. So, culture is shared. We share culture with other members of our group. We are able to act in socially appropriate ways as well as predict how others will act.
mhm,
So the shared culture is becoming more and more prevailing because of globalization and technological developments. So the patterns of culture bind us together and enable us to get along with each other. Even though it feels good to be around people who think, act, and behave as you, shared learning can create blind spots.
mhm,
So, culture is symbolic and integrated. Culture is based on a shared set of symbols and meanings. Symbolic culture enables human communication and must be taught. So, culture use symbols to create and communicate values and traditions to the cultural group. So, symbols are used to be used by a culture to identify other people who are part of the same culture and how their ways to connect and relate to one another in a culture. So in culture is integrated. The important thing about integration is that the individual cultures and members of cultural communities are welcomed and accepted for what they are, and there is respect for the practices, beliefs, and values of that culture. So, yes.
okay.
So, example of culture as learned is one of the example is custom and tradition are learned through social interaction and are often passed down from generation to generation. Example of this is religious ceremonies, holidays, and rituals. So, culture as share include belief, value, and norms, which beliefs are shared ideas about the world and how things work, while values are shared ideas about what is important and desirable. Lastly, norms are shared expectation about how people should behave in certain situations. Culture as symbolic includes symbols and rituals. Rituals. Symbols are object, words, or image that represent something else. Ritual are symbolic action that are used to mark important events or transitions. Lastly, culture as integrated. It includes art, music, and literature, which art is a form of expression that is used to convey ideas and values. Music is a form of expression that is used to convey emotion and meaning, while literature is a form of expression that is used to convey ideas and values.
Now let us move to culture as ongoing event. So next slide, please. So all of us know that culture is an ongoing event. So there is this specific process which we call enculturation, in which someone acquires cultural knowledge from birth and applies it in social interaction. So enculturation process can be adopted from our surroundings to build ourselves into being part of them. We can also see the result through seeing and observing, not just from teaching or speaking that are taught by our teachers and parents. So we are taught from a young age about what is appropriate and inappropriate conduct. We are also taught on how to blend into the culture of the area which we live. So, enculturation is the source of our ability to act or react, to become or angry or to talk sanely. So enculturation not only helps us to build ourselves into being part of the community or help us to blend into the culture of the area in which we live, it also teaches us the morality, the values, the language we use to communicate expectations and traditions. So enculturation can be learned from both formal learning or education, which we receive in school and colleges, and informal learning, which we receive from our parents, can contribute to this process. So now let us move to cultural symbols. So a particular set of people's ideas, traditions, language, and values are referred to as their culture, while nationalism, religion, and a variety of cultural concepts can all be expressed through cultural symbols. So symbols are created and learned through interactions between individuals where they eventually acquire significance. So symbols could also consist of sounds, objects, images, or vocal or nonverbal behaviors. So the common example for this is the Santo Niño, in which Cebuanos believe that it perceives as a symbol of hope and providence.
So just like what Angel said, enculturation is the individual learn the language, value, beliefs, and behavior of their culture, while cultural symbols include flags, national items, religious symbol, and traditional clothing.
So the next characteristic refers to culture as a complex entity. So what does this refer to? Why does it refer to as a complex entity? Well, when you think of culture, you don't only get one idea of what culture is. There are the elements of practices, beliefs, how it has been integrated, how it has been shared to people as from generation to generation. Next. So it is, as I said, it is a complex concept because there are instances where some cultures disagree with another and sometimes don't understand why this culture does these practices and this doesn't and the like. So this brings with it an understanding that it is not simply the parts within the system that determine how the system works or behaves. It is the relationship between all of these parts within the system that matters. So culture is a system or some sort of like a machine with different parts that encompass it. Next.
So example of this is culture is made up of many different elements including language, religion, art, music, literature, food, and clothing, which each culture has its own unique set of values, beliefs, and customs that are passed down from generation to generation.
Next, we have culture as an evolving process. Next slide, please. The concept of cultural evolution refers to changes in socially transmitted beliefs, knowledge, habits, skills, attitudes, languages, and other aspects of human culture. Cultural evolution is described as either human evolutionary process, that is similar in some aspects of biological or genetic evolution. Cultural evolution is cumulative such that small improvements to skills and technology accumulated results in complex products that no individual could have possibly designed alone without any learning from others. The reason for this fast accumulation is because of two aspects, namely gene-culture coevolution and culture-culture coevolution. Gene-culture coevolution occurs when the genetic composition of a population responds to changes in the cultural environment, while culture-culture coevolution occurs when a culturally inherited cognitive mechanism evolves in response to a cultural environment, altering that environment and enabling further evolution of the cognitive mechanism without any underlying genetic change. Cultural evolution serves to bind people and ensure their survival.
You have less than a minute, guys.
So example of culture as an evolving process can be seen in art as different cultures interact, they can influence each other art style. For example, the influence of European art can be seen in the art of North America. Technology. As technology advances, it can have a huge impact on the way people live and interact with each other. For example, the invention of the internet has changed the way people communicate and access information. Lastly, we will introduce our members. So
That's cute.
it's our
Okay.
graduation photo.
Murag na-surprise lang tanan. Dear.
So
Okay.
welcome to our graduation photo.
Okay. So mga cutie, graduation pics mga bata. Okay. Are you done? So I have
Yes,
one
ma'am.
general question for the group. Since you were able to provide very comprehensive examples and descriptions for each of the characteristics of culture and how they are related to the anthropological process, my question is for the group. Okay, how do you think is the self, the sense of self or the self, okay, how is the self contextualized or situated in the anthropological perspective? So, in short, how does the anthropological perspective view the concept of self as a whole? Yes, Arabella.
Miss, so overall, Miss, the anthropological perspective of the self would emphasize the importance of understanding the self within the cultural context. So it recognizes the complex ways in which the self is shaped and defined by the various social, historical, and cultural factors.
Okay, thank you very much, Arabella. So, thank you everybody. We are 5 minutes na extend ta. Sige lang. So, we will continue on Wednesday. Okay, so thank you everybody and we'll see each other on. So, thank you. Ato na kuha ka. I still have a class at 11:30. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye.
miss.
Yun,
Bye,
goodbye.
Miss.
Thank you,
Goodbye,
Miss.
thank
Bye
you,
and thank
miss.
you, Miss.